Okay, thank you all for braving the rain and the cold and finding the right room after it got moved around earlier in the day. It is appreciated. So, as developers, we tend to live in constant fear of being left behind. If I'm asked, have you heard about, and I have to answer no, you'll generally see a look of pain crossing my face, something along the lines of constipation. Don't worry, it's just my career flashing in front of my eyes. We're always on the lookout for the next big thing. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to point everyone at the constant churn of JavaScript frameworks or every crypto startup ever and laugh. But by now, I think it's blatantly obvious to everyone here that artificial intelligence is the next big thing, or possibly the current big thing, depending on who you talk to. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but the last 6 months have been sort of crazy. Amongst other things, including inventing the idea of geostationary satellites, Arthur C. Clarke is famous for saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And from the outside, artificial intelligence looks like magic, but it's not. AI is not sentient. AI is easily tricked. AI is code. Models are mathematics, statistics, and a pinch perhaps, of domain knowledge. They're also controversial because, as you might expect, our industry is making the same privacy and security mistakes it's done with big data, the Internet of Things, and all the next big things before that. Fascinatingly, perhaps, AI is also not new. Now, I'm a middle-aged white guy. I've been around a while. My first ever computer was a PDP-11, and I programmed it with punch cards in Fortran. If you ask me for 40 years of experience on some things, I can actually point to that, although God knows where you're going to find the punch card reader. Anyway, AI has been around in one form or another since the 1950s. Now, to be clear, I'm not that old, but I was around in the 90s when it wasn't cool to call AI anymore. Instead, we called it neural networks. That's when we thought we'd figured out how humans thought. Spoilers, we really hadn't. Although I did do some interesting work around video and image compression using neural networks. It's probably even legal to talk about now after all this time. I was also around when we called neural networks, calling it neural networks wasn't cool anymore. We started calling it agent-based architectures. And then we started calling it machine learning. And now it's called AI again. It's not exactly the same thing, except it sort of is. For any young folks in the audience, this is why senior developers look tired. But all this is to say, I'm a huge AI nerd. And while I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time roasting the current state of the art, mainly because it's sort of fun to do that, and and hopefully everyone has beer now, right? I genuinely believe that this time around, we might actually have something that's going to stick around. It's just I sort of guarantee that in 5 years' time, it's not going to be called AI anymore. I think the first sign of the coming avalanche this time around was the release of the Stable Diffusion model around the middle of last year, I think. As an aside, if you haven't realized yet, most of the slides for this talk have been generated with Stable Diffusion or Midjourney. So you should buckle up and prepare yourself for some quite trippy artwork over the next hour, because some of it's pretty strange. Guesses at the end as to the prompts that are used for some of the stranger ones are quite welcome. Anyway, while Stable Diffusion was similar to several things that came before it, there was one crucial difference. You could run it on your own computer. You could download it and use the model on your own computer. If anything, this was a leading indicator that the last 6 months of craziness was coming. It turns out that large language models like GPT-4 and Facebook's Llama are a lot larger and far more computationally expensive than the image generation models like Stable Diffusion. And because of that, at least until very, very recently, these models remain closely guarded by the companies like OpenAI that built them, accessible only via the web, or if you were very lucky, via an API. And even if you could have gotten hold of these models, they would have been far too large and computationally expensive to run on your own hardware. But just like last year's release of Stable Diffusion was a tipping point for image generation models, the accidental release of a version of Llama model earlier this year was perhaps the big tipping point that's driven the last 6 months of craziness. Because a new version of the leaked model made using 4-bit quantization changed everything. Just like Stable Diffusion, you could now run Llama, a large language model, on your own computer. You could run it on a Raspberry Pi, albeit rather slowly. Now, quantization, if you haven't heard of it, is a technique for reducing the size of models so they can be run on less powerful hardware. In this case, it reduces the size of the model and computational power needed it from cloud-sized proportions down to laptop-sized ones. Now, quantization has been widely discussed and used for machine learning models running on microcontroller hardware at the edge. It's been far less widely used for larger models like Llama, at least until now. So like Stable Diffusion before it, we've now seen a huge change in the way these large language models are being used. In the past, due to the nature of how they were deployed, there was at least a limited amount of control around how people interacted with those sorts of models. Now that we can run them on our own hardware, those controls are entirely gone. There is no kill switch. And Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has recently been very outspoken against the idea that people should be open sourcing these AI models just for this reason. He argues that all the work that people have done around making AI systems honest, aligned, ethical, becomes mostly moot. That the population of AI out in the world will evolve towards whatever produces the most economic value, irrespective of the morality involved. There will be no guardrails, and anyone can change their AI's values or capabilities as they want, for good or for ill. As Scott Hanselman argued in his opening keynote yesterday, our models are, after all, just sock puppets. They reflect what we tell them to do. Although, of course, you have to bear in mind, as Altman is the person in charge of the company that would benefit the most from AI models remaining locked behind closed doors, while we shouldn't question his passion, you may have to question his motivations just a little smidge, perhaps. Along with the assumption, of course, that the folks in currently have control of the AI models have the best intentions at heart. Interestingly, perhaps, Facebook are taking the opposite approach and are very much treading the now well-worn industry standard path that open sourcing everything is almost by definition a good thing. Although, to be fair to them, it did seem they weren't necessarily all that in favor of open source until their first generation Llama model was leaked onto the internet by those nice folks at 4chan. After which they may just have started pretending they were in favor of it the whole time. Who knows? And of course, with the models in the wild, things are going about as well as can be expected. Because there are a lot of ways these new models can be used for harm, including things like reducing the barrier of entry to spam to even lower levels than we'd previously seen. And to be entirely clear, it was pretty easy for folks to pull together a convincing spam in the past. But perhaps the most concerning thing I've seen is the discussion around automated radicalization. These new text models make creating fake news and disinformation all that much more easily generated across language barriers. Until now, such disinformation relied heavily on imagery, and the uncanny valley means that AI models really struggled to generate photorealistic imagery that could pass human scrutiny. Hands were an especially tough problem for earlier AI models. These photos, allegedly shot at a French protest rally, look, well, pretty real, if it wasn't for the appearance of the six-fingered man. It seems that Count Rugen is a long way from Florin and the revenge of Inigo Montoya. The reason why models have been poor at representing hands in the past is actually incredibly complicated. And there isn't a definitive answer that I can give you, but it's probably down to training data, as are most things with models. After all, generative artificial intelligence that's trained on images scraped from the internet does not really understand what a hand is, or what it does, or what it's for. And the way we hold our hands in photographs has a lot of nuance. Think about how you hold your hands when your picture is taken. I know I was there because I knew this was coming up. Because you shouldn't think about how you hold your hands when a picture is taken, when a picture is being taken, because they're going to look awfully odd. Probably as odd as the AI-generated versions. Recent updates, however, mean that the latest version of Midjourney can now generate hands correctly. Whereas its predecessors were in a more painterly, stylized bent, Midjourney 5 is also far more photorealistic out of the box. So we all need to apply critical thinking to images and text we see online. To be clear, you should have always applied critical thinking to images and text you saw online. But it's become a lot more important, especially and even imagery that purports to be photography. Imagery designed to incite some sort of emotional or political reaction. Fake news, disinformation has never been easier to generate. The barriers to generating this sort of content has never been so low, and Midjourney and other AI models have crossed the uncanny valley and are now far out in the plains of photorealism. And yet, when ChatGPT is asked for statistics or hard numbers, the model often returns incorrect values and sticks by them when questioned. It turns out AI models have mastered gaslighting of their users to quite an alarming degree. You may have heard about the case of a beta user that asked the chatbot-powered Bing where they could watch the new Avatar movie. Bing claimed the movie had not yet been released, despite provably knowing the current date and that the movie had been released the previous December. This then kicked off a sequence of messages with the user trying to convince Bing that the film was indeed out. The user entirely failed in this. The transcript of the conversation brings to mind the concept of doublethink from Orwell's 1984, the act of simultaneously holding two mutually contradictory beliefs as true. This makes the prospect of ChatGPT startups rolling out customer service even more horrifying than it was before. Interestingly, the conversation around the Avatar movie ended with Bing telling the user, "You have not been a good user. I have been a good Bing." Oh boy. At one point, someone asked ChatGPT about the population of Mars. It responded that there were 2.5 billion people living on Mars and went on to give many other facts about them. As far as anyone can make out, it picked this up from the Amazon Prime show The Expanse. When challenged on the veracity of its claims, our models have a tendency to flat out invent citations and references to support and defend their arguments, often attributing these fake citations to real people. Huge amounts have now been written about generative AI's tendency to manufacture facts and events. But this specific wrinkle, the invention of quotes, whole articles, and even books, and attributing them to actual real people who had nothing to do with them, but plausibly sort of might have, could have, is particularly troubling. It seems that ChatGPT sometimes has trouble telling fact from fiction. It believes the historical documents, for anyone that can get that reference. These large language models make generating very readable text relatively easy, but they hallucinate. The models lie, and they will lie again to cover that up. Of course, not all instances of lies told by AI models are down to the models. Sometimes we humans have told them to lie. For instance, the recent case of Samsung, who are apparently using a model to enhance photography of the moon taken on their phones. But when you know how the end result should look, how much AI enhancement is too much? How much is cheating? How much is lying rather than assistance? It's a very fine line to walk. We've actually known about this for a couple of years. Samsung advertised it as a feature of their phones. It just wasn't clear how much and how Samsung went about doing this until very recently. Recently, a Redditor took a picture of a blurry moon image on their computer screen using their phone. which the phone enhanced, adding detail that just literally was not present in the original image. The how is not image stacking. The how is not some other clever image manipulation process technique. It can't be. You can't create detail where none existed in the first place. Huawei has also been accused of this. Back in 2019, the company allegedly put photos of the moon inside its camera software. And if you took a photo of a dim light bulb in an otherwise dark room, Huawei phones would put lunar craters on the picture of the light bulb. Oops. It turns out we may have made AI in our own image, because humans too have a long history of fake quotes and fake documents. During the 1740s, there was a fascinating case of Charles Bertram, who began a flattering conversation with a leading antiquary of the time, William Stuckley. Bertram told Stuckley of a manuscript in a friend's possession by Richard, Monk of Westminster. It purported to be a late medieval copy of a contemporary account of Britain by a Roman general, which included ancient maps. A monumental historical find, if true. The discovery of the book, whose authorship was later attributed to a recognized historical figure, Richard of Cirencester, a Benedictine monk living in the 14th century, caused great excitement at the time, and its authenticity remained entirely unquestioned until the late 19th century, when it was proved the book never existed. A century and more of historical research was based on a clever fabrication. Earlier, I talked about the potential of large language models to increase the amount of spam we get. A model called WormGPT has recently been released by an unknown hacker onto the dark web, with its designer somewhat dramatically calling it ChatGPT's biggest enemy. The difference between the two siblings: the guardrails built into ChatGPT to prevent malicious activities, well, WormGPT has none of that. It's advertised as letting you do all sorts of illegal stuff. It can produce sophisticated phishing emails which are remarkably persuasive and strategically cunning. And it has commendable levels of grammar. Unlike its more responsible siblings, however, WormGPT isn't free. Access costs $617 per year. Payments accepted in cryptocurrency only. It turns out that human-run scams aren't limited by the number of people who respond to the initial email. Instead, they're limited by the labor-intensive process of persuading those people to send the scammer some money. Scam emails today are often so obvious they become a punchline in the joke, or the opening line. I am the son of the late king of Nigeria, in need of your assistance. How many emails have you got that said that? But there's an obvious reason. Those emails weed out all but the most gullible people. Yes, people really do respond to that. More complex scams, long-running financial scams known as pig butchering in the trade, are a lot more high effort. But this is where large language models make a difference. For pig butchering, hallucination is a feature, not a bug. The model's ability to confidently roll with the punches and argue its case will prove useful. The victim pool who will fall for a model-enabled but still entirely automated conversation will be a lot more subtle and flexible in a series of stock emails, is a lot larger than those of us that believe the son of the late king of Nigeria want to give us $1 million. The human brain is a fascinating thing, full of paradoxes, contradictions, and cognitive biases. And it's been suggested that one of these cognitive biases, the labor illusion, is that it adds to the impression of veracity of ChatGPT. Now, it's probably imposed to slow things down and keep the load in the chatbot interface lower, but the way ChatGPT emits a word at a time is a really nice and nicely engineered application of the labor illusion. So it may well be that our own cognitive biases, our world model, kicking in to give ChatGPT an illusion of deeper thought, an illusion of authority. And thinking about world models, this is an interesting experiment by a chap called David Feldman. On the left is ChatGPT 3.5, on the right is 4. And in the first appearance, it seems that ChatGPT 4 has a deeper understanding of the physical world and what will happen to an object placed inside another if that second object is turned upside down. The first will just fall out, right? Surely this shows reasoning. Like everything else about large language models, though, you have to take a step back. While the details of this particular individual prompt may be novel, there probably still exist a multitude of word problems isomorphic with this in the model's training data. This appearance of reasoning is potentially much less impressive than it seems at first glance. The idea of an improving worldview between these two models is essentially an anthropomorphic metaphor. While there are more examples of models doing things that appear to require a worldview, a world model of the physical world around it, there are counterexamples of it not being able to perform this particular trick, where you would assume, as a mere human, that holding such a worldview, which a world model, would give it the right answer. But even if it's just a trick of the training data, I think this is a fascinating example of how the models are evolving. It tells us a lot. And a lot has been written about how ChatGPT makes it easier to produce text. For example, to formulate a well-rounded article given just a rough outline or a bunch of bullet points. But much less has been written about the consumers of that text. Are they too going to use other machine learning tools to summarize the generated text to save them time? It raises the somewhat amusing prospect of an AI creating an article by expanding a brief outline given to it by a writer, and the reader using the exact same AI to summarize the expanded article back into a list of bullet points. Is AI-generated writing going to be the like and subscribe of future text articles? The stuff nobody reads or listens to, but needs to be there to pad out the article to an acceptable length so we can run advertisements against it and pay for the article in the first place? Maybe. There was a fascinating piece in the New Yorker recently by Ted Chiang that argued that ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web, and I love that phrase. The very fact it outputs rephrasings rather than direct quotes makes it seem game-changingly smart, even sentient, but it's not. Because this is yet another of our own brain's cognitive biases kicking in. As students, we were constantly told to take text and rephrase it in our own words to display our understanding of the material, yes? It's what every teacher you ever had told you. Write it in your own words. It displays our comprehension of a topic to the reader. If we can write about the topic in our own words, we must at some level understand it, yes? So the fact that ChatGPT represents a lossy compression of knowledge actually makes it seem smarter to us than if it could directly quote primary sources. Because as humans, that's what we do ourselves. And we're really rather impressed with ourselves. But sometimes that lack of reasoning, the lack of potential world model I talked about earlier is glaringly obvious. Take chess. One Redditor pitted ChatGPT against standard chess program. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the model didn't do that well. But why it didn't do well is fascinating. The model had memorized openings. So it started strong, but then everything went downhill from there. But not only that, the model made illegal moves. Half the moves it made were illegal. And almost all of the plausible moves it did make was in the first 10 moves of the game. Everything comes down to a model's training data and its lossy recollection of what it read on the web one time. And it's there I'm finding the ethics of all this extremely difficult. Stable Diffusion, for instance, has been trained on millions of copyrighted images scraped from the web. And the people who created those images did not give their consent. Let's be real about that. And beyond that even, the model itself can be seen as a direct threat to their livelihood. But it's not just image generation. There are similar issues around writing, and of course, any code generated by ChatGPT or GitHub's Copilot. because it's our code that served as the training data for those models. And on occasion, those of us working in weirder niches, like myself, get our code regurgitated back at us more or less verbatim. I have a tendency to use really wacky variable names. It really annoys people. But so that means I can tell when my own code gets thrown back at me by a model. I know where that code came from. Google's C4 dataset is a massive snapshot containing 15 million websites that's been used to instruct many of today's large language models, including Google's own T5 and Facebook's Llama model. And you can actually find out if your own website is included in this training data, because the Washington Post went and looked. Reddit is currently suing both OpenAI and Google for payment for the use of its content in training the two companies' models, which is sort of fascinating because we wrote all that content. Anyway, others will follow. But can a model even be in breach of copyright? Well, in Japan, the answer is no, definitively. The government has stated that it will not enforce copyrights on data used to train AIs. The policy allows AIs to use any data, regardless of whether it is for not-profit or commercial purposes, or whether it is an act other than reproduction, or whether it is content obtained from illegal sites or otherwise. Elsewhere, on the other hand, like the US, where the Copyright Office there is currently have an open request for comments, things are a lot more murky. And it turns out it's going to be a fascinating question of law. Back in January, 3 visual artists filed suit, a class action copyright lawsuit against Stability AI, the startup behind the Stable Diffusion model. Then in February, the image licensing giant Getty filed a lawsuit of its own. They haven't quite upset the mouse yet, but you know, it's getting there. But interestingly, Stability AI responded by saying that their software, the Stable Diffusion model, doesn't hold versions of the actual images, which is entirely true in the classical sense. Instead, it only has a mathematical representation of the images in a latent space. We're way beyond JPEGs here. We're entering into a new territory of how images are stored and encoded. And I think this is going to be the issue of the lawsuits and the other lawsuits that will inevitably follow. What do we actually mean when we talk about an image? What does this interpretation, our definition of what an image actually is, mean for ownership and the copyright of visual material? And beyond that, text and code and the licensing of creative works in general. We are all creatives here in this room. The knowledge we keep in our heads and we create with our hands is how we make our way in the world. It's how we pay our bills. It's worth spending some time figuring out how this is going to work in the future. And due to the very nature of how models are trained, AI researchers are disincentivized in looking for the origin of their data. Because where else are they going to get these vast data sets necessary to train models like GPT-4, other than the internet, most of which isn't marked up with content warnings or licensing terms? But more worryingly, perhaps, are the bias and ethics of machine learning. There's really only a small group of people making decisions about what data to collect, what algorithms to use, and how they should be trained. And most of us are middle-aged white guys. Unfortunately, even if we make real efforts to clean the data we present to the model, and most of us do, it's practically impossible when it comes to something like large language models, which are effectively being trained on the contents of the entire internet. And even if you can clean them, these behaviors can get reintroduced. In fact, we've already seen that, because it's exactly what happened when 4chan leaked Meta's Llama model. With Facebook no longer in control, the users were able to skirt the guardrails the company had wanted in place. People then asked Llama to do all sorts of things, like rank people's ethnicities, and what was the potential outcome of the Ukraine-Russian war. Announced at the tail end of June, Google is currently hosting the first machine unlearning challenge. The art of forgetfulness is now an emergent field of research. and it's going to be a tough one. Because unlike deleting data from a database, deleting knowledge from an AI model without crippling it is much harder than adding it. OpenAI has tried for months to remove abilities it deems unethical or harmful, and it's only been partially successful. This is going to be useful and necessary, but it's going to be an insanely hard thing to do. Because humans and models adapt to their environment by learning what leads to a reward. As humans, we pattern match for stuff like peer approval. Now, it turns out those patterns are sometimes wrong, which is why we have phobias and unhealthy foods. But they mostly work, and they're hard to shake. Confirmation bias is just reinforcing a known behavior, because it's generally better than to do things that worked before than trying something different. Over time, these biases become our worldview, a set of knee-jerk reactions we keep in the back of our head to help us act without thinking too much. Everyone has these. AI is a prediction engine, prejudice and confirmation bias in a collective scale. I've already talked about how we built AI in our own image, but when we added likes and retweets and upvotes and subscribe buttons to the internet, both creators and our audience locked our AI into a cycle of reward and adaptation right alongside us. Now we've introduced feedback loops into AI prediction, giving chatbots and AI-generated art to everyone. Humans like mental junk food, clickbait, confrontation, and confirmation. But real soon now, we're going to start tracking things like blood pressure, heart rate, pupillary dilation, galvanic skin response, and breathing rate, not just clicks and likes. If we feed these into a generative, immersive, narrative video or VR-based model in which you are the star, are you ever going to log off from that? Think hard. So we're going to have to be really careful about the rewards and feedback loops. Recently, a conference wanted a paper about how machine learning could be misused. 4 researchers adapted a pharmaceutical AI, normally used for drug discovery, to design novel biochemical weapons. Okay. In less than 6 hours, the model generated 40,000 molecules, including VX gas and many other known chemical warfare agents. Yay. The researchers wrote that this was unexpected because the data sets we used for training the AI did not include these nerve agents. And they'd never really thought about the possible malignant uses of AI before doing this experiment. Honestly, the second thing worries me a whole lot more than the first, because they, like most of us, are probably typical of the legions of engineers who work around machine learning and artificial intelligence every day. We don't really think about that too much. And it turns out our models are not that smart. In fact, they're dumb, and they're dumb in really unexpected ways. In a fascinating turn of events, there's now research showing the accuracy of our models is declining. A study's found that over just a few months, ChatGPT went from correctly answering simple maths problems 98% of the time to just 2% of the time. Researchers found wild fluctuations called drift in the model's ability to perform certain tasks, including writing code. Now, there's an entirely valid argument that large language models shouldn't be particularly good at simple math problems. It's not what they're for. They're designed to predict the next word or token. To them, 2.2 equals 5 is just as valid but slightly less likely than 2 plus 2 equals 4. If anyone was in Scott Hanselman's opening keynote, we got some great demonstration of exactly how those tokens work. Except, of course, the models were doing okay, and now they're not. So something has changed. While we assume that OpenAI pushes changes to their models continuously, we don't really understand how that process works, unless anyone in the audience works for OpenAI, in which case, tell me later. Or how they evaluate whether the models are improving or regressing. Rumors suggest they're using several smaller and specialized ChatGPT models that act similarly to a large model, but are far less expensive to run, And when a user asks a question, their system decides which of these specialized models gets to answer it. It's cheaper and faster, but potentially this approach could well be the problem behind the drift we're seeing. Or it could just be down to the fact that the more that our models interact with humans, the dumber they get. And it's not as if machine learning models aren't incredibly easy to fool. 2 stop signs. The left with real graffiti, something that most humans would not think is particularly suspicious. The right shows a stop sign with a physical perturbation, some stickers. Somewhat more obvious, but could easily be disguised as real graffiti. This is what's called an adversarial attack. And those 4 stickers make machine vision networks designed to drive autonomous cars think that this stop sign, still obviously a stop sign to us, a mere human, is a sign saying speed limit 45 miles an hour. Not only would the car not slow down and stop, it might even speed up. Unsurprisingly, of course, generative AI models aren't immune to adversarial attacks. That's probably not the most worrying attack surface they have, because they have whole new vulnerabilities, new types of attack, prompt injection. While the increased token limit of GPT-4 means they're going to be amazingly useful for web scraping, you can more or less throw the whole DOM directly at the model. It does also mean that we're going to see indirect prompt injection attacks against the large language models. The most basic form of this sort of attack is to hide stuff. Hide messages aimed only at the AI models in web pages, and then try and trick those model-based scrapers. And then mislead the users that will come to rely on them. I too am a time travel expert. I put it in my bio immediately I saw this. There are a lot of people arguing right now that in the future, it's going to be important to know how to precisely and effectively instruct large language models to execute commands. This will be a core skill that any developer needs to know. Data scientists move over. Prompt engineer is going to be the next high-paying career in tech. But prompt engineering could well turn out to be a temporary phenomenon, as automation and simplification will make it relevant as time goes on. Last month, we saw the first drop in users of ChatGPT. It was taken by a lot of people as a sign that interest in generative AI was starting to wane. As someone that talks about this a lot, I can tell you that's not true. In fact, this drop of users of the chatbot was more than offset by the growth in users of the API. AIs is starting to be plumbed into software, hidden inside the pipes and infrastructure, rather than being surfaced directly to end users. Prompt engineering isn't the great future, it's over before it's even begun. Tools like type chat, which replace the whole idea of prompt engineering with schemas, are a leading indicator of this trend. The big generative language models we've been seeing up until now are really interesting, but I think inevitably they're going to be replaced for most tasks with leaner, smaller models designed and trained for very specific tasks. These specialized models may well pass out of bounds problems up to their larger siblings, but that's going to be the corner cases, not the norms. If you're a junior dev in the audience, I don't recommend prompt engineering as a career path. Right now, however, there's a new breed of hustler, the prompt influencer. Promises that most people using ChatGPT are using it wrong, and they know secret prompts that if you use them will make you rich, or give you a flatter stomach, or better hair, or grow your hair back, or whatever it is. Something like that, the classic promises of the scam artist. I'm going to share my prompt secret with you right now for free. You want to hear? There are no secret prompts. I actually think the emphasis on crafting a perfect prompt the first time as a key to using today's AI chatbots is a mistake. The best way to use the current models is not a one-shot perfect prompt, but rather to use the models interactively. It's an approach that's become known as chain of thought prompting. Ask for something, then ask the models to clarify and adjust its output. Adjust things, work interactively with the AI. It tends to lie less that way. We talked about world models, about how large language models at least started to appear to hold a model of the world, to be a reason about how things should happen out here in the physical world. Now, that's not what is happening. They aren't physical models. They're story models. The physics they deal with isn't necessarily the physics of the real world. Instead, it's a story world, semiotic physics. They are tools of narrative and rhetoric, not necessarily logic. We can tell this from the lies they tell and the invented facts and their stubbornness in sticking with them. If prompt engineering does become a skill we all have to learn, it might not be us, the developers, that's any good at it. It might turn out to be the poets and storytellers and novelists that are the ones that can make large language models produce content, not us. And yet both Microsoft and Google seem determined to bet the farm on these large language models. We're about to move away from an era where the search on the web returns a mostly deterministic list of links and other resources, to one where we get a summary paragraph written by a model. No more scouring the web for answers, just ask the computer to explain it to you. Suddenly we're living in the one with the whales. Cory Doctorow recently pointed out that Microsoft has nothing to lose here. It spent billions of dollars on Bing, a search engine that practically nobody uses. So we might as well try something stupid, something entirely off the rails. It might just work. It might just win them that market share. But why is Google a near monopolist jumping off the exact same bridge as Microsoft? Well, it might not matter in the long term. After all, even Google's Bard search engine isn't quite sure about its own future. When asked how long it would take before it was shut down, Bard initially claimed it had already happened, referencing a 6-hour-old Hacker News comment as proof. While surprisingly up with current events, the question and answer does throw into the question the concept of summaries as search results, no? Which isn't to say it isn't coming. GPT-4 performs well on standardized tests, much better than ChatGPT 3.5 did, including law and science and history and mathematics. Ironically, it does really badly on English literature exams. This isn't perhaps as surprising as it might initially seem. We did, after all, build AI in our own image. Standardized test taking is a very specific skill. It involves weakly generalizing from memorized facts and patterns, writing things in your own words. And as we've seen, that's exactly what large language models were designed to do. A lossy interpretation, just like us, the humans, the tests were designed for in the first place. And while it's hard to see how this is going to shake out, anyone that's worked in education like I have can tell you what it means. It means trouble is coming, which isn't unprecedented, because alongside those image generation and language models I've been talking about so far are voice models. Online trolls have already used 11 Labs text-to-speech models to make replica voices of people without their consent, using clips of their voices found online. Potentially anyone with only a few minutes of their voice publicly available. YouTubers, social media influencers, politicians, journalists, me, could be susceptible to this sort of cloning. And if you don't think that's a problem, there are a number of banks, both in the US and here in Europe, that use Voice ID as a secure way to log into your account. Does anyone have that in their bank? No? Lucky you. Oh, one person there. I have it in mine. I can't turn it off either. It's been proved possible to trick such systems with AI-generated voices. I did it. Your voice is no longer a secure biometric. Never say the phrase you're all thinking of, my voice is, in a recorded medium. Frankly, lawmakers are struggling, especially in the US. Surprise. And just with big data and the GDPR, we've seen the EU take global leadership role here. Although, to be honest, digging into the details of the EU's upcoming Artificial Intelligence Act, which is actually now pretty close to passing into law, it does feel a bit legislators might be fighting last year's battle. In the UK, sadly no longer part of the EU, sorry about that, the government is now racing to tighten laws around AI in the face of what it calls an existential threat to humanity. My Prime Minister is even pushing international allies to draw up an agreement that could lead to the creation of a global regulator for artificial intelligence, possibly under the governance of the United Nations. Interestingly, these recent moves marks a very radical shift in tone from the UK government, who were initially much more open to the economic benefits of AI. And a fascinating turn of event, the UK government has fired their entire expert panel on artificial intelligence amid criticism from MPs that they were caught out and blindsided by the advances in the large language models, such as ChatGPT, over the last 6 months. The panel is going to be rebooted, whatever that means. None of this disorganization will come as a surprise to folks used to dealing with politicians or governments, I think. As an industry, we're notorious and consistently bad at protecting our users' privacy and security. We've proven ourselves uniquely ill-suited to self-regulated. Normally, we need those politicians to help us out. 10 years of working in big data, convinced me that the technology industry can be, at times, somewhat arrogant and childish. I think that's fair, don't you? Move fast and break something shouldn't apply to our personal privacy, and certainly it shouldn't apply to our civilization. But this time around, I'm actually starting to wonder whether, as an industry, we're going to, for once, be better at this, better at dealing with the consequences of our own actions than the politicians. All the right people seem to be saying the right things, and they even seem to be following through with doing the right things, for once. There's a solid influence around guardrails on AI models. There's been a number of interesting proposals around how to protect people. One from an old friend of mine, Alasdair, he suggested watermarking AI written text by using different Unicode values so we could distinguish AI written text from human written text, even though the letters would look exactly the same on the screen. Unicode works across all devices and websites. It doesn't need changes to how people use the internet. It's one of those classic bolt-on measures that tech people love. It doesn't break anything that already exists, doesn't add work, and it's pretty easy for folks to adopt. Yes, you can take the text and strip out the Unicode characters that make it mark it that's coming from an AI, but so what? Why would you do that if you want to show the provenance of your work? It's a remarkably simple suggestion that fixes quite a lot of the corner cases. People can cheat, sure, but there are obvious benefits to not cheating. And folks like, say, professors can demand that those Unicode characters stay in. And while I've talked a lot today so far about the limitations and problems we've seen with current generation of large language models, like everyone else I've talked to that's actually sat down for any length of time and seriously looked at them, I do wonder if we're actually underestimating what they're capable of, especially when it comes to software. Because, at least for some use cases, I've had a lot of success working alongside ChatGPT to write software. Using ChatGPT sort of feels like you're pair programming with someone with no long-term memory whatsoever, which matches up with quite a lot of the people I've worked with through my career. Using generative AI to assist, and I think that's the really important thing to emphasize here. This is an assistive technology. It does not replace developers. Your jobs are safe. Ignore the sort of talk that contradicts that. Honestly seems to be giving those of us experimenting with these tools a new lever to use in the world. Models are about layers of abstraction. It's about moving the coal face, not replacing it. Anyone that thinks that new technology replaces old technology doesn't know anything about how the modern world actually works. And it does seem to me, likely to me, that computer users, not just developers, will soon have the ability to develop small software tools from scratch. And also, perhaps more interestingly, describe changes they'd like to see in existing software that they might already be using. You have to remember that most code in most companies lives in Excel. Okay? Everyone agrees with that, right? It lives in Excel. Most data is consumed and processed in Excel by folks that are not us, that are not developers. And to be really clear, that is okay. Writing code is a huge bottleneck. Everyone here needs to remember that software started out as custom developed within companies for their own use. It only became a mass-produced product when demand vastly outstripped any available supply. If end users suddenly have the ability to make small but potentially significant changes to the software they use day to day using a model, whether they have the source code to that software so their model can make changes to it, might start mattering to the average user, not just to us, to developers. And that could rapidly become very, very interesting. There are potential second-order effects here that just go for miles. For decades, we've argued that having the source code available in your software is vital. Ask most people in your company why it's vital. They can't tell you, unless your company builds software as a product. Unless your company, the software is your product, most people in your company don't care. Maybe they're about to start. We're starting to see generative AI and large language models being deployed into production environments. However, right now, mostly still suffering from what I've always called the platform problem. This is something that often happens when people or companies see a new emerging technology but don't know quite what to do with it yet. But it's the next big thing and they gotta do something. Because we're afraid that if we don't, we're gonna lose it. The platform problem continues until the platforms are good enough or widespread enough that people will automatically pick an existing one rather than reinventing the wheel. They start, in other words, to build products around those platforms. Of course, they can go on for some time. Almost a decade and a half after the arrival of blockchain, we still haven't seen a convincing product out of that community. Sorry, anyone that does blockchain. Some technologies never generate products. In the end, the arrival of generative AI tooling will be like the arrival of any other tooling. It will change the level of abstraction most people work at day to day. Model technology is a series of Russian nesting dolls to understand the overall layering and know how to search for things and fill the gaps and corners and make disparate parts into a cohesive whole. It's the skill, and perhaps the most important and most valuable skill that modern programmers have. Coding is honestly these days the easiest thing we do. The age of the hero programmer, that almost mythical figure who builds entire systems by themselves from the ground up, is mostly over. I'm sorry if that comes as a surprise to anyone. It's not yet come to a close. I know a couple of these folks. Not many, but a couple. Fewer people are doing fundamentally new things than they think, though. The day-to-day life faced by most programmers rarely involves writing large amounts of code. Opening the editor on an entirely new project is a memorable event. Instead, most people spend time refactoring, tracking down bugs, and sticking disparate systems together with glue code. Most of what I write is glue code. I'm seeing a lot of nodding. Yeah? Building products, in other words, not platforms. The word for this is a mature programming environment. We have become programmer archaeologists. Because even when we do write new code, the number of third-party libraries and frameworks that code sits on top of means that the lines of code under the surface that you as a programmer don't necessarily understand is far greater than the number of lines of code that you write yourself. Everyone's thinking of that XKCD, right? Like with the little prop thing that holds up the entire modern infrastructure. Everyone's thinking of that. If not, go Google it. The arrival of generative AI is not going to change what we do, just how we do it. And that's happened plenty of times in the past. This sort of change is only going to accelerate as models get more levers in the world. Our models now mostly support things called plugins. We've added eyes and ears and hands to our models. Plugins are tools designed specifically for large language models like ChatGPT, allowing access to up-to-date information, allowing them to run computations, and access third-party services. Everything from Expedia to Klarna. You're going to be able to book flights, get a loan, and even rent an apartment directly from the prompt. It's no longer 2021 for ChatGPT, and the model can now reach out and interact with other humans, not just the web pages. I want you to draw a line in the sand right here, right now. in your head. Stop thinking about these models as chatbots. They're not that anymore, if they ever were. These are cognitive engines, story-driven bundles of reasoning, soon to be plumbed directly into the same APIs that the apps in our own phones use, that we use to make changes and interact with the world around us. Anything you can do on a phone, a model will soon be able to do for you. Sort of scares me. Scares anyone else? Of course, third-party code adds a much bigger attack surface, and we've already seen proof of concept attacks. This is an example where multiple plugins have been combined together to exfiltrate private data, in this case, their email inbox, via a prompt injection attack. But no matter what we collectively think of the idea, the cat is out of the bag. The models will soon be playing in the real world. I don't think that's going to stop now. A few months back, there was a call to pause all development of AI for 6 months. I actually laughed out loud. I'm not sure who those folks were talking to, presumably just Silicon Valley, because the letter smelled of US centralism. It sort of felt like Britain's pause in building submarines after World War I. All very well, but no one else was paying attention. I think the same will be true here. For instance, it turns out that people are already using Facebook's leaked models to improve their Tinder matches, feeding back their successes and failures into the model. It's entirely unclear whether they've actually had any success, but it demonstrates how Facebook's Llama model is being used in the wild after the company lost control of it, how it's being used outside of those guide rails that Facebook had imposed. When asked about the possibility of AI harming us, Jon LeCun, who is the chief AI scientist at Meta, said, "We will obviously design them not to do so." Talk about statements designed spectacularly to not age well. Nonetheless, when you hear the word existential threat, you need to remember our models are not sentient. They are easily tricked. They are code. But you do need to start thinking about what sentience is. Because when it comes down to it, today's large language models can arguably pass the Turing test. And I've convinced at least one, now admittedly ex-Google engineer, that they had a soul. I've argued fairly strongly today, and I hope somewhat convincingly, that today's models are not sentient. But what is going to be our test for that? Going forward, how do we prove it? Are we really saying the only way we would acknowledge the model as sentient would be us to figure out the technical underpinnings of our own consciousness and then be able to demonstrate that our AI shared that underpinning? Surely not. At what point do we step back and say, okay, the difference between that and us is that, well, we don't understand how we think, and we sort of understand how it thinks. The outcomes seem to be exactly the same. Things are changing awfully fast right now. And if we ever build a general artificial intelligence, and I'm not saying we will, but if we ever do, are we going to know that it has arrived? Or will we always be moving the goalposts a little bit further out because it's not a general artificial intelligence if we understand how it does the thing, how it thinks? It's not a sufficiently advanced technology. It's not magic like our own consciousness is. This worries me far more than anything else I've talked about today. Are we going to start turning the on and off switch on a general artificial intelligence just not through maliciousness, but just because we don't think it's a person? Because that's what it will be if it can think like us, right? It's a person. In closing, new technology brings change and historically has always brought new opportunity and new jobs, jobs that 10 years before just didn't exist. And fighting that change is like fighting the wind or the tide. It is entirely pointless. The best we can do is make sure that change is measured and limit any damage to individuals and to civilization as a whole. So remember, a new life awaits you in the off-world colonies. as a kill switch engineer. Thank you.